Hello and welcome back to another episode of Creedle. I am joined today by my friend Robert Mixa, who is a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute and been on the podcast once before, Robert, or
Yeah.
twice? Once.
Once before.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll do it again. We'll get the count up there. But I'm excited to have you back on. I read a
Thanks
couple of
for
your recent pieces on the Word on Fire Institute blog, and thought that'd be fun to just have you on and talk about these things. The first of them was what I'll call the Unseen Realm piece. And it was your exploration of how there's a renewal of interest in New Age ideas and ideas that transcend the strictly sort of materialist world around us. And I've been thinking about this for a year or two now in some detail, because I read an article in the New York Times, and I don't remember when this was, probably a year ago. And I'm going to look it up while I talk. And it was an article about a renewal of interest in astrology apps. So our generation, Robert, is going out there and downloading. Here it is, April 15th, 2019. So I'm corrected. Almost 3 years ago, venture capital is putting its money into astrology. So people like you and I are going out there, Robert, and saying, I'm going to buy a subscription, $5 a month, $8 a month, or whatever, $60 a year for the bargain discount. I'm going to go buy the subscription, and I can rely on this app to interpret cosmology for me, the positioning of stars and planets, and then tell me what I can expect to get in my future from that. There's something very anti-scientific and I use scientific in sort of today's modern use of the term. So, something very anti-scientific in that, but there's something I think that speaks to our deepest needs, our deepest desires, and really this innate recognition in the human heart that there is something more than strictly the material world. Now, obviously, I'm not endorsing astrological apps. I'm not endorsing astrology. In fact, I condemn astrology. But there's something in the resurgence of interest in astrology that speaks, I think, to this desire, this recognition of the reality of the unseen realm. What do you make of that, Robert?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know about that piece in the New York Times, but my the way I really started to realize that this is something people are interested in. It's just my basic field study in used bookstores, and also in the classroom with high school students who, you know, they didn't have like any of the Christian terminology, even the basics of the biblical narrative down, but they were all talking about astral self or astral form and kind of using transcendent language in a very new agey way. And so that really, I took that seriously, and they took it seriously. At first, I thought this was just some kind of like boutique thing, that here's us, consumerist, materialistic moderns, and we're just going to revel in this little thing on the side. And in a way, I think I think kind of something like the will to power and it all being about the self and this, differentiating today's practice of these things from maybe the more ancient way of practicing it is important. And in the article, I referenced David Bentley Hart's book, article called Christ or Nothing, which gets at a lot of that, kind of it being about the self. It's important, but at the same time, you're right. I think it's an expression of this desire for something more than just living in kind of this atomistic, meaningless world. It's a search for meaning. And if they're looking to the stars for that, I mean, we should be there to point them beyond that. But, in documents, like the church had a great document called, I think it's called Christ the Water Bearer. Jesus Christ the Water Bearer. It came out, I think, in 1998 or something. It's an excellent document, and it actually says, yeah, there is this meaning to the cosmos. There is, a world beyond your head that's full of spirits, and the church doesn't really declare much about this, but it's pointing everything to Christ in the end. So I think that was my goal, was to take their desire for meaning seriously. And if they're finding it in things like the New Age, well, I'm there to acknowledge that and to point them beyond that.
Yeah, that's. I think it's great to have an educator or to be an educator that is attuned to these needs in students, because they need to be pointed to what is beyond that. I mean, Richard Dawkins, for example, just to use like a sort of classic stereotypical example of an atheist. Richard Dawkins looks at someone who's interested in astrology and says, "You're wrong, and you're wrong because the only realities around us are material realities, right? That which we can taste, touch, smell, etc. Those things that we can apprehend with our five physical senses, those are the things that are real. And there's not even a plausible physical mechanism by which the cosmology has any impact on your personal life. So any belief in the linkage between the two is absurd, on its face." Dawkins is right, obviously, that astrology is not true, but he's wrong on the reasons for why it's not true. It's not true because it has to do with these things that sort of transcend the five senses. It's untrue because it's untrue, right? And it's untrue for other reasons. And as a Catholic, we can recognize that the reason it's untrue is because it is not grounded in Christ, Jesus Christ, the water bearer, as you said, and as this document that I'm looking at from the Vatican says. This document is important, and I think it's actually prescient too. It was written in, I think you said 2002, early 2000s, okay. Right?
Yeah.
2002, 2000, maybe it's 2003, early 2003. One of the questions is, why has New Age grown so rapidly and spread so effectively? And let me just read a few sentences here. Whatever questions and criticisms it may attract, New Age is an attempt by people who experience the world as harsh and heartless to bring warmth to that world. As a reaction to modernity, it operates more often than not on the level of feelings, instincts, and emotions. Anxiety about an apocalyptic future of economic instability, political uncertainty, and climatic change plays a role in causing people to look for an alternative, resolutely optimistic relationship to the cosmos. I mean, that sounds like it could be written today, doesn't it, Robert?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But it is significant that New Age has enjoyed enormous success in an era which can be characterized by the almost universal exaltation of diversity. Western culture has taken a step beyond tolerance in the sense of grudging acceptance or putting up with the idiosyncrasies of a person or a minority group to a conscious erosion of respect for normality. Normality is presented as a morally loaded concept linked necessarily with absolute norms. For a growing number of people, absolute beliefs or norms indicate nothing but an inability to tolerate other people's views and convictions. In this atmosphere, alternative lifestyles and theories have really taken off. It is not only acceptable, but positively good to be diverse. I mean, really, for being written in 2003, incredibly prescient, I think.
Oh, yeah. And, I think a lot of this stuff also bears on some of the gender, almost body sexuality questions that are popping up today. I think the two of them kind of go a little bit hand in hand. And I think that the issue is actually what is reality? It's a metaphysical question. And then the question of like self-identity, how do you define that? It's something that people are searching. They're searching for some kind of meaning and significance in their life. That they actually have something like they have something like a vocation. They're looking for something like God's providence. But they just in a way, this stuff is gonna help them in that. So
yeah, I completely agree. I think you're 100% right. In your article about this sort of unseen realm, as we'll call it,
yeah.
You mentioned that you used to buy into Max Weber's view of modernity. And I'm not a Weber scholar, but like you, I used to think that we're all a bunch of positivists now, right? And I've shared a little bit of this on the podcast before, but at Oxford, I did my graduate thesis on international relations, but more specifically, this turn in the post-World War II era away from an emphasis on sort of the anthropological sinful identity of man and towards this view that, hey, look, we really botched some things, 2 world wars, millions of people dead. The way to overcome this is to form a new League of Nations, we'll call it the United Nations, and to just do social study after social study until we can really isolate the variables that make human peaceful coexistence possible. And so it really, the idea there is that the social sciences took a very positivist turn. What can we identify about the physical world around us? And that is how we achieve human flourishing. And so like you, I used to think that's what we are. Like we're just in this, we're in the 21st century now. We're just marching inexorably towards this positivist framework where the material world is the only thing we see. I now think I've now changed this idea. I now think we're really in a post-positivist landscape. where the material world is now seen as something that is probably, well, actually, I was going to say it's sort of ontologically antecedent, like foundational to the sort of metaphysical world. I actually don't even know if that's the case, because now I think we've arrived in this post-positivist state where, yes, it's true the positivist world is what we largely apprehend, but our identities, even, our sort of feelings and our emotions, are obviously not positivist. They're completely subjective, but they're almost even more valid than the completely objective physical realities in which we inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't exactly know why that is, but I think I don't know why we've sort of already moved beyond the positivism. But there's something good in that. And the good news for the Catholic is, hey, there's this recognition that the physical world is not all that there is. The bad news is that our post-positivist mentality emphasizes all the wrong things, because it is, like you mentioned, David Bentley Hart pointed out, it's all introspective, and it's all about, like, how do my feelings make me how do my feelings sort of make me express myself towards other people, and how can I always validate my feelings no matter what they are, right?
Yeah, yeah. Um, as you talk this through, I'm thinking of Marx an awful lot. Augusto Noce, I'm kind of getting into him now, and just kind of seeing how Marx, in some ways, finds his fullest expression in something like the consumerist West. In terms of when you said, we have to look for, it's not the problem like something like the fall in man, but it's getting in like all these conditions right to realize something like a utopia. And
Right.
there's no really meaning in the world, but that we then have to conform ourselves to. But it's like we have to kind of get in this project of self-creation. And so possibly like a lot of the things that we're seeing now in what you're calling post-positivism is just, be oneself, realize oneself, whatever that
Right.
may
Right.
be.
Yeah.
Which is oftentimes a very good way that all these companies can come sell their products.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, that's a really interesting insight. My thoughts on Weber are changing a little bit. In grad school, we had to read The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and
Mm-hmm.
this is not the professor's fault, but I kind of had this conventional view of Weber, which probably I wasn't very like attentively reading the text, which was like, okay, yes, Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, okay, led to like this sense of worldly calling. You don't have the sacraments anymore, so people find their salvation through something like savings, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have the rise of capitalist economy and all that, and you gradually then have the disenchantment of, or if you want to say, the cosmos is no longer sacramental. But I've been reading this book called "The Myth of Disenchantment." It's got a kind of crazy cover here,
Yeah. It's
but it was published by
nice.
the University of Chicago Press.
So
Um,
is that Faber on the front?
you know what? I don't think it is. I don't think it's
Oh,
Weber,
okay.
but
It's someone who's very disenchanted then.
yeah, and this book is fascinating. I have to admit, when I first I listened to it on Hoopla, and when you're
Oh yeah.
you're driving or walking the dog, you're not as attentive as you should be,
Right. Sure.
especially
Sure.
here in Dallas. I mean, gosh, horrible drivers. So I'm getting upset all the time, and so I didn't like listen to it as attentively as I should have. But I've been going through this, uh, and I mean, this is just a fascinating history, and it's making me rethink so many of the conventional, if you want to say, myths. Not trying to say that he's now going to tell you the true story. He still thinks he's kind of telling another myth. So
Yeah.
he has some issues. His name is Jason Jofferson Storm. Interesting guy. But
I found this. I'm going to put this a link to this book in the show notes for listeners who want to pick up a copy or get it from your
yeah,
library.
but he goes through like a bunch of figures. One of which is Max Weber,
Hmm.
and he shows kind of like how this conventional view that we have of his view is almost like, oh yay, okay, finally we have the disenchanted world. But he was intensely interested in things like mysticism. So he was not like some kind of rationalist in the sense of, okay, let's just try to have something like this pure science, and anything like spirits and all that stuff we're just going to put aside as kind of an obscurantism that doesn't belong in this new age. No, he was intensely interested in this stuff, and he even thought of himself in a way as something like a mystic. And even though he didn't think that there was going to necessarily be something like a re-enchantment, he was hoping for that.
Yeah, that's
yeah. And what he does in this book, though, is he takes so many of these early 20th century scientists, like famous Madame Curie, and shows how they were fascinated by this spiritualism. They were going to mediums all the time, and so this blending of magic and science kind of went together. So
yeah,
it's fascinating.
That is really interesting. I wonder. So yeah, that does make me also rethink a little bit of what I have thought about sort of the march of science. I wonder if it's the same today, or if there are certain sciences that are more limited in the sort of enchantment. For example, Curie. I don't know how many nuclear physicists today, go to mediums or get their palms read or have an astrology app on their phone. Maybe it's more than I think, but I wouldn't think that many.
Yeah.
But I do think, Silicon Valley, the place where all of our technologies that we have in our phone pocket, or in our pockets on our phones are made. It's very popular in Silicon Valley to not be Christian. In fact, it's unpopular to be Christian, but it's very popular to be spiritual but not religious. And so there is definitely this enchantment. It's also it's not something you can question people on, right? You can never ask them what exactly they believe, but it's almost expected that you'll be spiritual but not religious.
And,
that you won't scoff at people using a meditation app on their phone. You'll just let them do that and respect them for it because you probably do it too.
Yeah. So how to read that too with this age, kind of where Thomas Jefferson said, right, it neither breaks my leg nor picks my pocket, whether my neighbor is Buddhist, Christian, or an atheist.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting too that like yoga and like kind of this almost say cult of well-being is taken over, but yet still are they materialists? I don't know.
Well, the interesting thing is, and this is again, in accordance with David Bentley Hart's thesis, but the interesting thing about this whole sort of wellness revolution is that it is, if not primarily, at least largely sort of immaterial, in the sense that, people do intermittent fasting to boost their wellness and whatever, but also there's a lot of yoga and there's sort of transcendental meditative practices, this whole spiritual but not religious aspect to it. But all of it is pointed inward. So why do people do it? Is because it makes me feel good, right? Like I have to do my yoga meditation. This isn't me, obviously. I'm just as an example. I have to do my yoga meditation in the morning so that I can feel like calm and ready to tackle the day, right? Or I don't know. I have to do my headspace meditations to calm down so that I can sleep better and get better sleep at night. So it's still very introspective in that sense and geared towards a fundamentally materialist end, perhaps. And maybe that's the difference. I also think there's a lack of conviction now. Going back to my Silicon Valley example, no one wants to say what's wrong. And no one really wants to say what's right, unless it's only with respect to your own frame of reference, right? Like, this is right for me. This feeling is valid for me. I can't say what's valid for you. I tend to do, yoga every morning, and Robert, maybe you do something different, right? But like, it works for me. I can't say what is good for you. So there is this sort of lack of conviction that we're unable or afraid, perhaps, to say what is actually true. And we just are willing to recognize everything as equally valid and true, which is, I think, an interesting turn. It's different from the disenchantment question, but it's maybe even more interesting because it still gets at the heart of the enchantment, because we're asking like which, it's kind of like the McIntyre question, right? Whose justice, which rationality? Like whose unseen realm, right?
Yeah. Getting at the question of truth, I know uh, Michael Hanby, one of Larry Chapp's friends and one of my
I
teachers.
like
Oh
Hamby a
yeah,
lot. Yeah.
he has a lot an interesting take on this, especially how he kind of focuses in on John Dewey and also the importance of. I brought up Thomas Jefferson earlier, but
Hmm.
Jefferson's view on a lot of this, in the sense that those, if you want to say hard truth questions, um, as opposed to kind of what Vadimo might call soft truth, are just
Yeah.
we're not going to go there. And so there's really no
Right.
interesting
Right.
question being asked in the public realm.
That's so true.
And so
Yeah.
things like contemplation, um, yeah, you're right. I think in the sense that it has an introspective function, but what we need to do with the term even transcendence, and what we need to do is in helping those who are spiritual but not religious, is to see that yeah, they're only going to have that true transcendence in relation to another, namely God, who's given to Himself in Christ, and that I feel like that I like what I was trying to do at the end of this article was try to open up something like the need for mystical theology and really
Mm.
exposing students to the uh, the church's 2,000 year mystical tradition, which obviously is centered in Christ, but finds in some ways forerunners in some Jewish mysticism, but also in some Greek, Platonic mysticism. I tried doing that in the classroom, and this was something that a lot of the students were never exposed to, but they were fascinated by. So mysticism, I think
Yeah.
it's so important.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. It's something that's not lost on me as I work for Hallow, this Catholic prayer meditation app, and that's one of the things that Hallow is trying to do is make people aware of this 2,000 year Christian tradition of mysticism, some of which draws, as you mentioned, on earlier traditions. Because I mean, I talk to a lot of lapsed Catholics, as I'm sure you do, probably even more than me, given your interaction, given your position at Word on Fire. Um, but a lot of people who are lapsed Catholics, like they went to Catholic school, and to them it was just a bunch of rules. Maybe they got their hands wrapped with rulers by nuns, and they were just told to get back in line when they got out of line. And when they asked a question about, why do we believe Jesus rose from the dead, the answer is just, well, that's because the church teaches that. So, it's true because the church says it's true. Um, there are much better reasons, much better reasons for believing that it is true beyond simply this is in, Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. But we don't give people a chance to really engage with those questions. And so that's not about mysticism per se, but when we reduce the church to just this more or less from the outside arbitrary looking set of dogma, of course people are going to leave. That's not going to
Yeah.
enchant. So you bring up a really interesting point here that we have sort of disenchanted the
Yeah.
church even by reducing it to a catechism, right? The catechism is great. I love the catechism. It's a fantastic catechetical tool, as it should be. But the catechism is not the essence of the faith. The essence of the faith is Jesus Christ, around whom all the universe coheres. It all
Yeah.
holds together, as Paul tells us in Colossians. So yeah, we need a re-enchantment of the Catholic imagination before we even can talk about
Yeah.
re-enchanting the world.
Larry Chapp, was it on your show, Zach? Which he said, uh, yeah, the catechism's important, but you just can't, cite the
I think
catechism.
he did say
I
that.
mean, you mentioned
Yeah.
it's kind of this like this positivism thing. I mean, it's just like this is kind of what ticks me off a little bit with some apologetics that I see. It's like people, ask a question and then you cite the catechism, but it's like
Right.
okay, yeah, but they don't even hold the church as an authority. So why
Right.
why should they care? So yeah, what we need to
Yeah.
do, I think, is just really try to like kind of address the desires of the human heart for that encounter with
Mm-hmm.
the fullness of meaning, namely Jesus Christ. And this is why I'm so attracted to the work of Luigi Giussani. In a kind of communist world that probably is in terms of worldview like similar to, if you want to say, just the kind of like materialist, almost technological way we view things. He came in there and he proposed the gospel again. So yeah, I mean, there's just I encourage everybody to look at Jasani. He's really good on this stuff. But I agree with you that the church, what I got in high school was a real strong emphasis on Catholic social teaching, which is great. And so I knew about solidarity and not so much subsidiarity, but solidarity was like really emphasized. But they never
Yeah.
really put in the context of the church's like doctrine. I mean, there's all this
Mm.
emphasis on the pastoral, but it was never informed by the doctrinal. And
Right.
for me, I didn't connect the Eucharist with actually feeding the hungry. There was a disconnect for me. So I just thought, well, if that's what Catholicism is, then like why go to mass? What's the point
Yeah.
of the Eucharist? And the whole gospel, to be honest, didn't really make much sense. Um, but I think what we need to do really is do a better job of connecting the two, and the centrality of the Eucharist is really really important here. So I mean, the work of David Fagerberg about like connecting the doctrine of like liturgy, but then also going out into the world and in some ways bringing the world into the liturgy and having that, if you want to say, liturgical cosmos, seeing all things like that, and man as a high priest, and all of this kind of stuff that which is the Catholic view, is so needed today.
I'm not familiar with the work of David. So Luigi, Father Luigi
Cisani, yeah.
Cisani, I think servant of
I
God
think so.
Cisani,
Yeah, yeah.
Luigi Cisani is the founder of
Yeah.
Communion and Liberation. But I'm not familiar with David Fagerberg. I just looked him up, professor of
Oh
liturgical
yeah.
studies
He you got to
at
have
Notre
him
Dame.
on. He's a big Scandinavian. I mean, Fagerberg.
I mean, he's got this fantastic beard and flow going on. He looks great in
It,
this picture here
yeah,
on
and
the
every
Notre
time
Dame
I see
website.
him, he's wearing sandals, even up in South Bend during the
Wow,
winter. Um,
wow.
yeah, but he's so good. I mean, he's like the Alexander Schmemann. You guys probably
Hmm.
know him,
Yeah,
of Catholicism.
yeah.
Um,
It's
yeah,
high
I mean,
praise.
the
Wow.
liturgy for him is kind of the key that opens it all. I encourage you to take a look at his works. I gave my students this little brochure just that he wrote called like "Why the Mass," and
Hmm.
he just opens up this kind of liturgical anthropology, man or human being as priest, and the whole cosmos as liturgical. And so he's really good at
Wow.
connecting all the dots, and like Alexander Schmemann, kind of totally opening up the Catholic thing for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. I'm gonna see if I can get him on. That's a great suggestion. Let's move on and talk a little bit
Oh
about the
yeah.
metaverse, Robert. You also wrote a recent piece about the metaverse, and the metaverse in most of my social circles is kind of a punchline. Mostly since Facebook announced its efforts to rebrand, move away from some of the policy distractions and problems it's caused for itself relating to digital privacy and censorship. Rebrand to Meta. Facebook is no more. Now it's Meta. And they're, in the words of Mark Zuckerberg, they're fully pivoting to the metaverse. I saw an ad. You've probably seen the same ad for the metaverse that looked absolutely
Was this the
terrible.
Super Bowl
It
ad?
had someone who I actually don't know if it was in the Super Bowl.
They had one
Let me
there,
see.
which yeah.
Okay, well, tell me about the Super Bowl ad. What was
Well,
that one
I
like?
mean, it was just kind of like showing the movement from like it was like a Chuck E. Cheese type of what do you call those Chuck E. Cheese robot dolls? Like remember they used to sing and what do you
Like
call them?
not like a Rock'em
No,
Sock'em
no, it
robot.
was like remember you go eat your pizza and then you'd have these robots or these things singing for you and they're like I don't know, it was like a big dog and he's it, it is what do you call
Yeah,
those
yeah, yeah.
things?
Okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I
Yeah, I don't
see
even
it's in
know.
the
I don't
past,
even
and
know.
so they're moving now into the
Yeah.
future. But what in the past
Ah.
was, is no longer needed today. Well, we're going to then bring
Mm,
that thing into the metaverse, and it's going to have this community, and it can connect with all its friends and buddies, and just by putting on these goggles, it's somehow you're gonna just enter into this land of bliss. So it really, those goggles, I mean, they're just these huge things. I mean, that alone did not, it still has not
Yeah.
convinced me to, to go meta. So,
Not at all. Yeah, the commercial I saw sounds about as bad. There was someone who looked kind of like Kristen Bell. I don't think it was actually Kristen Bell, but looked like Kristen Bell playing this main character who puts the goggles on in her living room. Her husband is, I think, in the kitchen behind her, and then she enters the metaverse and she's interacting with all these people in the metaverse, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and it was very like upbeat and kind of fluorescent colors in a very artificial, contrived sort of way. And this whole time she's interacting with people in the metaverse, and her husband is literally in the same physical room as her, but she's not interacting with her husband because she's interacting with people in the metaverse, of course. And someone pointed out on Twitter that this really looks like The Good Place, if you've seen the
I
television
have
show The
not.
Good Place. And oh, okay. Oh man. Well, the premise of The Good Place, this is a pretty major spoiler. So listeners, fast forward like 20 seconds if you don't want to hear the spoiler about The Good Place. The Good Place is heaven. It's billed as heaven in the beginning, and it's like you can have as much ice cream as you want, any kind of food you want. It's a perfect place with perfectly manicured lawns, etc. But it's actually hell, and it's like an experimental hell where one of the chief demons wanted to see how much he could make people suffer if he gave them what they thought was heaven, despite them not having earned or deserved heaven. And they're really in just this sort of like infinite loop of hedonistic pleasure, right? And so someone pointed out that like here we have someone who looks like Kristen Bell in the ad. It's very sort of like Good Placey, and then it makes it look
It's
so
really,
perfect. And they said like you can tell that this is actually the bad place because they try so hard to make it look like the good place. And I thought that was really appropriate, and shows the pitfalls of this. Like Facebook is trying to construct for us this meta world where nothing ever goes wrong. Like all these avatars are just always smiling, and you can literally do whatever you want. And if something makes you uncomfortable, you can just digitally exit into another experience. I think there's talk about like taking the metaverse into dating. Like imagine going on dates with your Oculus headset, sitting in your
is,
living room and talking to someone else sitting in. It's just such a bizarre
I mean,
concept to me.
the goggles themselves, aren't they like uncomfortable enough? Why? Yeah,
They're at least heavy.
they
Yeah,
look,
I've never
yeah,
worn
they
one,
look
but
uncomfortable, but
yeah, they look ridiculous.
yeah,
Is what they
it
look.
does sound kind of like that. Yeah, that seeming heaven, which is actually hell. That's good. That's good.
Yeah,
Um,
it's. I would say The Good Place is worth a watch for season one. I think it kind of went downhill after that, but season one
okay,
you should check
is
it out.
that with what's his
Yeah,
name? Uh, who? What's that show? Boston Cheers. What's his name? The
yeah. It's
oh, Ted
Danson, right?
Danson. Yeah,
Ted
yeah.
Danson.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I think I
That's
know.
him.
I
Yep.
think I know that show. Andrew Pettigrew was talking about it because it recently ended,
Yes.
right?
Yes. I think it did. I stopped watching after I think the third season because it's a lot of these shows have shelf lives, and when it passes the shelf life, it's out of original ideas and just gets kind of ridiculous. So,
Yeah. Well, yeah, the metaverse, man,
but yeah,
it's crazy. I don't know. I have to be careful because sometimes I can sound like a luddite, and um, yeah, but I'm the guy who's like tweeting things about why we should all be luddites. But yeah, I'm addicted to
right.
my phone. But anyways, it just to me like especially you see in the Wall Street Journal them talking about buying real estate in the metaverse. I mean, I don't understand this stuff to begin with. Um, but yeah, like having friends and this like perfect existence that doesn't involve anything like risk. Just yeah, it seems like
Yeah.
hell. Um, but I actually before the whole metaverse thing and before COVID and like all this talk of just living online and that being okay, um, I was reading Hubert Dreyfus's book on the internet. I don't know if you've heard. Yeah, Hubert
Never read it.
Dreyfus. I mean, he's an interesting cat. I mean, that guy. He was, I think, an atheist, but friends with like people like Charles Taylor and a bunch of Catholics, and he he was a philosophy professor at Berkeley. But before that, he taught at MIT, and he was famous for kind of being
Mm.
the school's phenomenologist. He studied, I think, the thought of Martin Heidegger, and was really kind of influential in popularizing Heidegger out here in the States. But he was extremely critical of the artificial intelligence crowd and some of the what he thought was hubris back in like the 1960s and 70s. But when the internet started, I think he wrote the book on the internet in like the late 90s, and then he came out with the second edition in the early 2000s. So this was before the Facebook or Meta age. And but all the insights that he had in that book, like what would this online community, because he talks about Second Life a lot, which is kind of,
okay.
I mean,
I'm familiar with Second Life.
What I know about Second Life is actually the metaverse is similar to that in some respects. But he just has a great analysis of it there, and kind of comes at it from this phenomenological way of viewing things. But he talks about the importance of embodiment, the importance of risk, all these things to live a genuinely human life. And so I was trying to draw people's attention to that. And I actually wrote a little something on that before COVID, but I thought, well, maybe I need to like redo that a little bit in light of all these things, and now Meta redirecting people to that book again. So,
yeah, it's a good idea. Well, I appreciate your piece, and you did mention the Dreyfus book in the piece. I want to pick up this on the internet as well. It's really interesting to see how presciently some humans can think about these things. His points about that you just mentioned about risk, I'd be curious to read more about what he says about risk, because that's one thing that has struck me. Like risk, one of the things we don't give risk credit for is shaping our character, right? But it plays an immensely important role in shaping our character, because through risk we build courage, and through risk we understand more about the nature of our embodiments, and we understand how to make prudential decisions to best protect those that we love and ourselves. And so when you have something in the metaverse, risk is almost zeroed out. You know, I think like my example previously about going on dates in the metaverse, right? If a date's not going well, you take off the headset, right? Like you disconnect, you're done. Never have to see this person in real life. You have no idea who they are. When a date's not going well in real life, like you've got to deal with it, and you have to work through that, and you have to work through the awkwardness of it. I mean, same thing with like, you know, working up the courage to ask a girl on a date. I mean, this is something that Andrew and I talked about a little bit in our last conversation about like the lack of romance in the movies. We're entering this age where romance, I'm using air quotes for people who are listening to this, romance is much more easily obtained through, you know, a computer screen than it is by like going out to a bar and meeting people. And so that's like the easy button. Now that's obviously not real romance. That's, I mean, the whole point is that's not real romance, but that's the easy button. And the metaverse is like the easy button for life. And so there's no character formation that happens in the metaverse. And that's one of my biggest concerns about it, and what it portends for us as a whole, because it's through acting through our embodied souls that we actually build character. And it's through building character that we become the people that God wants us to be, that we really achieve eudaimonia, human flourishing. There's no eudaimonia in the metaverse. There's hedonia, right? There's just like fulfillment of pleasures and the things that make you feel good, but there's no eudaimonia. That's the big problem as I see it.
That's well put. Dreyfus, you should look at, I think with his brother, who did a lot of work for the Air Force. They did a lot on skill acquisition. And so he actually, I think for the United States Air Force, they wrote up something, the 5 distinct stages.
I see this 5-stage skill acquisition model.
I think, you know, this is really important to keep in mind, how to become an expert in something. And part of that, is taking risks. At like a certain point, right? You just gotta like throw the child into the swimming pool and let them swim. I mean, but today we just like we're not throwing people into those types of situations anymore. I'm not trying to glorify risk taking just for the sake of risk taking, like,
sure.
you know.
But the thing is, like, living is a risk, right?
Yeah,
Being alive entails risk. And so, and this I think is relevant to a lot of sort of COVID discussions that I've had privately with people over the past 2 years. But there's no such thing as a
yeah,
zero risk life. It
yeah,
does not exist, right? There is only a life in which risks are balanced and prudentially
yeah,
accepted or not accepted.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
what life
And
is.
like, to become a full integrated human being, to have that eudaimonia, that full flourishing, as you said, um, we need to, like, instead of breaking up with someone uh, through text messaging,
Yeah.
I mean, you should go face to
Yeah.
face and explain your be in that
Yeah.
uncomfortable situation. Um, but unfortunately, we're not seeing the need for that, for real character formation. So I'd be interested, Zach, since Air Force background, um, like the military. I mean, I'm sure the military is like wondering, okay, what this. I don't want to say like sound like the old man now, like getting worried about
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
younger
Sure.
generations, but in the past, it just seems like you had a society with a lot of kids, right? In which, if you had a brother, they're going to double dare you to do something. And you had, in some ways, show your, like, okay, I'm going to go to the high dive, okay? And I'm not going to just
Yeah.
jump
Sure.
off.
Sure.
I'm actually going to go head first and dive right into that pool.
Yeah.
I just wonder today if even with kind of like my wife is teaching third grade, and she asked the kids, "Well, what do you guys do together?" And they all play video games, on the weekends, and they're not interacting with kids enough. But this is
Yeah.
why I think like sports is still like a really good thing for kids, because you have to take risks,
Yep.
you have to prove yourself, and all these things. But I think like the military must be a little bit worried about maybe a generation of people in which maybe they're going to have to then force them to take certain risks. So
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak for what the military is and is not worried about. I can speak for what I'm worried about as someone who's been active duty and is currently a reservist. And yeah, I share your concerns for sure. A couple of things, and this is obviously a longer conversation, but we want to think of the military as sort of like the warrior class, because that's how it has been for much of the
mm-hmm.
history of the West, right? Like we think back to the Spartans, and we sort of glorify the warrior class and the Greek city states. And there was certainly part of those traditions that were inherited throughout most of the West, up till the very recent day, I think. Now it's just not that way. And if you want to find that, I think you can find elements of that in some of the more elite, like highly physical units, special operations command type of units, some Marine Corps units. I think most of the Air Force, really, and this I'm speaking as an Air Force guy. Most of the Air Force is just taken over by like bureaucratic, technocratic attitudes and behaviors that really erode the warrior spirit in that way. And there are not opportunities for character formation like there may have been in years past. So it's definitely a huge problem. However, I will also say I'm really not sure that our times demand it. I mean, I think like our humanity demands it. I think it's a good thing to be well formed, but I don't know if we need a warrior class, because the problems that we face are not unique to us. I will say, however, in a counterpoint to that, China recognizes this as a problem, right? Russia recognizes this as a problem that the West has to deal with, and China might have to deal with some of it, and Russia probably has to deal with a little bit more of it, but not to the extent that the U.S. does. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
definitely a problem for sure.
And you're right. I mean, not needing to have a warrior class is, yeah, important to stress in our times. Um, but yeah, it's just interesting that something you mentioned, technocratic way of looking at things. Things like Metaverse. It's interesting that like it's there to they market it, right, as if it's there to solve a problem, like, okay, the need for more community. But it actually, you
Hmm.
never really address the real problem. It's not going to solve that problem. But there has to be another way of actually addressing that. But it in some ways it's putting its finger on the issue, the lack of community, of relationship. So
That's true. Yeah. It does raise an interesting question, though, for me, which is how do tech companies always delude themselves into thinking that they are solving a real problem
yeah,
with a good solution? You know, there are tech companies. There are really two kinds of. Well, I guess there are three. This is like Zach's pyramid of tech company hierarchy, right? At the bottom level of the pyramid are people solving problems that don't exist, right? And so that's most of them, right? That's the biggest part of the pyramid. You're solving a problem that does not exist. This is a solution in search of a problem. The vast majority of tech companies go there. The second tier is this is a bad solution
ah,
to a bad problem, right? So this is a real problem that you've identified that needs to be fixed. This is a bad solution to it. That's the second most common tech company. At the very top, the unicorn tech company, and unicorn normally means something different in tech terms, but you know the very rare tech company is one that has a good solution to a
so
real
where do you
problem.
place the metaverse?
But the vast majority fall into those two. The metaverse is
Okay.
definitely in tier two, and Facebook is as well. But the problem with tier two is that you know the solution in search of a problem normally pretty much harmless, and those things sort of get weeded out by the market because there is no real problem that they're trying to address. The problem with tier two is that those bad solutions end up often magnifying the problems they're trying to solve. And so in Facebook's case, Twitter's case, right? Hey, we need platforms for community and discourse and fellowship building. And they build these just like completely toxic online cesspools of filth and somehow delude themselves into thinking, yeah, we're solving the world's problem by connecting everybody. Look, 10 years ago, people were not nearly as connected, but now we have, you know, an empirical validation of the six
Yeah.
degrees of separation theory. Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah,
And no,
it's
it's not
funny.
wonderful at
Yeah,
all.
like
It's terrible.
once we get Twitter, communication is going to be great, and yet communication breakdown. Same thing with community.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm starting to sound like a luddite, so you might have to rescue me here.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think, you know, I think if my tripartite theory of tech companies is right, then we should really be luddites towards about
Yeah,
95%
and
of the
the
technology in
Luddites,
our
man,
lives,
just
right?
to put in a good word for them. I mean, they weren't against technology, but they were for like
Yeah.
technology that's ordered properly. That actually does like
Right. Right.
allow for genuine things like art and skill and craftsmanship and
Yeah.
ultimately eudaimonia, right? So we just have to be a little bit more
That's right.
thoughtful. This is why I always wonder. I'm like, what are the discussions
Yeah.
like when they're coming up with these ideas, like you in these tech companies? Like, all right, this is what we're going to do. What are the discussions like? How they think about things,
Yeah.
and actually getting a good philosopher like Hubert Dreyfus in there. I mean, I wouldn't say he's the best philosopher. Sometimes when you hear, you read his writings on God, you're kind of like, wait a minute, dude. You just need to go
Yeah.
read some Aquinas.
Yeah. But he's incisive at thinking
Yeah,
through the technological
yeah,
questions,
yeah.
right? Which is
Here
really
at
what
my
you're getting
work,
at here.
I bring up Heidegger sometimes, and everybody just, I mean, the minute I mention Heidegger, they just think I'm a Nazi too. Yeah, so I mean, and Bishop Barron,
I mean, it's kind
yeah,
of like Carl
yeah.
Schmitt in that
I don't know
regard,
how
right?
long Carl Schmitt was in a member of the National Socialists. Probably not that long, but yeah, Heidegger. I mean, yeah. I don't want to reduce him to that, and he has tons
Yeah.
of problems. Um, but there's a great essay that he has called "The Essay Concerning Technology," um, that I just think is right on this kind of technological worldview that we're just kind of stuck in. And some of it, his last interview with Der Spiegel, and this gets a little bit at that Re-Enchantment stuff we were talking about. He
Hmm.
talks about waiting for the gods. I mean, I think he intentionally, to be provocative, puts that in there. He's kind of into that like
Yeah. Yeah.
German
Yeah.
romantic, pagan stuff a little bit too much, maybe. But the sense that we
Yep.
need to
Yep.
return to something like a re-enchantment that's maybe properly Christocentric, as like what Giussani was calling for, is a good way kind of out of this, if you want to call it like imminent frame that we're all stuck in, coming up with solutions, supposed solutions, but making to problems that either don't exist or making the problem even worse. So
Yep.
Heidegger, I don't know. I'm not for recovering Heidegger. I mean, but he was on to something, and yeah.
I gotcha. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's as one of my friends in college mistakenly said once, trying to say even a blind squirrel finds a nut. He said even a blind man finds a squirrel once in a while. So
Yeah.
I jokingly use that version of the maxim when appropriate. Well, Robert, this has been great. We're just about out of time. Remind my listeners, how can people find and follow your work?
Yeah. So every now and then I have an article coming out through Word on Fire. I also have my own personal website, robertmixa.com. I think that's right.
Yep. I'll link it.
And yeah, so I'm a fellow at the Word on Fire Institute. So if people are really interested in kind of the philosophy of education, I'm trying to kind of link that up with, theology, just philosophy, and just link all the three of them together. So if they're interested in kind of like, well, what would a Catholic like a philosophy of education look like? They can find more of my work at the Word on Fire Institute.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Robert. It was fun. I think next time
Thank you, Zach.
I'll have you and Andrew on together. We can talk about maybe Luigi Giussani and some other things. So it'll be fun.
Oh, that would be great. I look forward to it.
Great. And to my listeners, if you have a question for Robert, I'd be happy to pass it along. So send me an email, zac@creedalpodcast.com. Let me know what you thought of the episode. And until next time, God bless you.